I'm Tori Baker, and I partner up with the Science Center on this speaker series, which we just discussed. This is like our 19th year that this thing has been going on. So we've got some upgrades here. Last spring we started to do some Facebook Live with these presentations, and the reach has really, really expanded with these. And I would like to introduce Marysia Pearson, a Quota product that's now just moved back to Quota with her family, and she's working down at the Science Center. So she and I are messing around with this series, so I'm really looking forward to working with her. She's cool under pressure with technological difficulties. She's a keeper. So tonight, would like to introduce our two speakers. These are federal fisheries people extraordinaire, both researchers and analysts. And I'm gonna sputter Marysia's name. If you could give us your last name. Szymkowiak. And Sarah Marrinan. Marynan. Okay, I'm getting better. But these two gals are really, it's fun. They're going to be doing, they'll be talking about their work tomorrow night. Marissa's a social scientist down at the Fisheries Science Center in Juneau with nymphs. And she and Sarah joined forces over the last couple of years in doing the mandatory review of the IFQ sablefish and halibut program that was mandated through the council process. So I think they're probably joined at the fin somewhere. I think they've done a lot of good work together. Marysia herself is also interested in the impacts of fisheries and fisheries regulations on fishing families, and that's a listening session that she's going to facilitate tomorrow night at the Center. Sarah is a resource economist, and she is a full-time employee of the North Pacific Management Council and works on a lot of those mandatory regulatory reviews and analysis that the federal process is pretty heavily involved in. So, we do some heavy lifting too. So these gals are the federal presence, and we have a couple of folks here that are, one person is with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and a couple of fishermen, some Forest Service folks, and some just regular mortal Cordovans. So anyway, that's our audience, and this is these ladies. This is their presentation.
Great, thanks, Tori. So, as Tori said, Sarah and I co-wrote the 20-year review, and so this is going to be kind of like a Cliff's Notes version of that, focusing just on rural access and entry opportunities into the IFQ fisheries. Sarah's going to start out with a few slides about Cordova's fisheries participation in general. I'm going to go over the IFQ program review, and then Sarah's going to go over some related council items that are emerging from that 20-year review and some of the issues that came out of that program review. So I'll let you take over, Sarah.
Great, thanks. So I just have 3 slides here with just some general fishery stats specific for Cordova. So in this figure, the blue trend line shows number of vessels, and that's linked by vessel ownership to Cordova residents. You can see in the early 90s on to 2017, vessel ownership in the community. And then the bold line shows total vessel revenues for those boats. And we can see from this figure kind of a similar story we have seen in some other Alaskan communities in terms of number of vessels, and that's one of consolidation since the 90s, early 90s. And then similarly, from the 90s into about the 2000s, probably in part due to a smaller number of boats, we see a downward trend in some of the revenue, in the total revenue. So from about 760 vessels in the 90s down to about 430, so that's a 44% decrease in the number of boats. And vessel revenue we've seen more variability in the last few years. That kind of variability, even though we see some good years and some spikes there, that can mean some stress for participants in the fisheries and in the community broadly as well.
If I can just ask, so this is all landings, all species? species, all boats, all?
Yes, so this is looking at both state and federal fisheries, but not necessarily all landings. For instance, if there's a person who lives in Anchorage and they home port their vessel here in Cordova, that would not necessarily be represented in this figure. This is just people who register their address as Cordova and they own the vessel. That's what this is showing.
And it's all species then?
Yes.
That, you got a pretty big down curve from 91 down to 2005, and then it seems to level out really good. And you mentioned that this is consolidation. Could you just go into that? I mean, whatever you think about it. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a lot of different factors going on there. Since we do have a lot of fisheries probably involved in this, one of the big ones that we're probably going to touch on more in this presentation, the IFQ fisheries, halibut and sablefish. After that was implemented in the early 90s, there was big consolidation over the whole fishery and the number of vessels that were going out for those species.
Right, and at the same time, we had increasing revenues in those fisheries because, as I'm going to talk about, we had product form changes in halibut from a frozen to a fresh market, and so the ex-vessel prices increased, so the ex-vessel revenues decreased. So despite this kind of consolidation, some of the changes in the other fisheries like halibut and sablefish might account for increasing revenues, and this might also, the ups and downs are probably related really to salmon fisheries, because that's kind of, as Sarah's going to go over in the next slide, is really kind of where Cordova increasingly is putting all of its eggs.
Yeah, and feel free to chime in if, we're looking at some of these broad statistics, but you guys have a lot of experience in the community and might know some things that we don't about certain spikes or trends that you see. Oops. So the second slide here is a figure that shows CFEC permits for people that are registered in Cordova, and the trend lines show total permits. So this is looking at all different species. The green trend line shows total permits, and then the orange line shows total permits that were actually fished. And then the bar chart below is a subset of those permits specifically for salmon for people, for Cordova residents. So what you can tell right away from this figure is that salmon permits are representing an increasing portion of the CFEC permits that are registered to Cordovans. In the early 90s, salmon permits accounted for about 40% of all CFEC permits held by residents of Cordova, and now they represent about 65%. Salmon permits represent an even greater percentage of permits that are actually fished by the community residents, from about 50% in early 90s to about 80% now. So I'm sure not a surprise to anybody in this room, but salmon is obviously a big deal in Cordova fisheries. And then, so moving on to the third slide with just some general statistics. Marysia and I both work in federal fisheries, so we spend a lot of time focusing our energy in this area. Federal fisheries account for about 7 to 8% of total ex-vessel value for fish processed in Cordova and landed by vessels owned by Cordova residents. The number of halibut and sablefish quota shareholders has decreased in the community over time. This figure shows the bar portion of the figure shows the quota shareholders, and the trend lines, the orange and green trend lines, show for halibut in orange and sablefish or flat cod in green the amount of quota share units, the total amount of quota. So as we can see with the blue bars, that we see a decreasing trend of quota shareholders in the community. But there's actually, with the orange line, you can see an increasing amount of quota share for the remaining people that do hold quota. This is a little different than many other small Alaskan communities who have seen both a decrease in both quota shareholders and holdings, implying that some of the people that are left in the fishery have invested more in quota share.
So you're saying there's 8 million pounds of halibut quota in town?
Yeah, so this is, that's units, right? So, it's just a generic, units, and those units
Oh,
correspond.
8 million units,
Yeah,
oh, okay,
right,
okay.
yep, so, yeah, and so this is a little bit misleading too, because if you follow the halibut fishery, you know that the catch limits have been decreasing over the year, and those units get translated into pounds that
Right,
people fish.
Okay.
And so even though we see an increasing amount of quota share holdings in the community, that also represents less than what it was in the mid-90s because of decreasing catch limits. And so for sablefish, for black cod, the story's a little different. We see a little variability, but a little more consistency in the number of holders, and especially since about 2005, a lot more consistency in the quota share holdings in terms of units. Marysia?
Yep. I'm going to start with an overview of the IFQ program, and I'm going to try to specifically focus on the provisions of the program that relate to rural access and entry opportunities, and then the impacts of the program with respect to those things. So,
Excuse me, before you start, I just wonder, it might be helpful for you guys, how many folks in here are IFQ fishermen or hold IFQ? We do in our family in those days, and anybody else? Okay, a couple salmon fishermen, so I just wanted to let you know that you do
Yeah,
have some.
that does help.
okay,
Okay.
yeah. So when council was developing the IFQ program, as I'm sure you all know, the halibut fishery really and sablefish I guess as well, but not as much, were really operating under derby conditions. So you had really short openers, the fisheries were unsafe, the tax were often over harvested. And so the council really implemented the program to try to address these issues. At the same time as it wanted to reduce capacity in the fisheries, so the number of boats and their harvesting capacity, it also had a lot of other kind of social protection provisions in the program. So it wanted to protect small boats, Alaska coastal communities, and to provide for new entry opportunities. And so the objectives of the program actually kind of really list those things as objectives for the IFQ program. And so the council included a lot of different provisions in the program to try to address those things, and making it really a unique catch-year program in all of the U.S. in terms of the number and variety of these kinds of measures that it implemented. So I'll briefly go over these. I think for those people in the room who participate, you are well versed in the nuances of the program because you have to participate in it. But quota share in the program was either issued as blocked or unblocked, and so for the blocked quota share, you can't kind of split it up for the purposes of sales. And so the idea there was to ensure that small amounts of quota share was always available on the market for new entrants and small boat participants. Quota share was designated by vessel class, and so that's just the picture there is just for halibut. So the council kind of created these length ranges for each of the vessel classes for the quota share, and you can't trade between the vessel classes. So there was really kind of an allocation of quota share that went to each of the vessel classes in each of the IFQ areas. The council implemented a provision allowing what they called fishing down. So if you own quota share, so you can buy quota share of a larger vessel class. So say class B, which is for the greater than 60-foot vessels, and landed on the smaller vessels. And that again was intended to provide for entry and small boat opportunities. And so anything really related to small boat opportunities was expressly intended to protect Alaskan coastal communities because that's where most of the small boat participants were coming from. The council also included vessel and quota shareholder caps, so the amount of IFQ that you can land on any one vessel and the amount of quota share that any holder can hold. There's no leasing allowed in the program, but as many of you know probably, we do have hired master use, and so in some relationships, and Sarah will get into this a little bit, that is kind of a de facto leasing relationship. So a hired master is just anyone designated by the quota shareholder to land their IFQ. And the council did limit that, so they limited the ability to use a hired master to any initial recipient of quota share, so no new entrants or second generation folks can use a hired master. And the council provided that all new entrants have to be individuals, and those individuals have to have 150 days of experience as part of a harvesting crew in a U.S. commercial fishery. So, and I don't even think I covered all of them, but really the IFQ program had numerous measures intended to affect these things. But there have been a lot of changes since IFQs, and I'll really just kind of, again, briefly highlight the ones that would have had the highest impact on rural access and entry opportunities. So the seasons increased from, in some cases, 24-hour openers to now 8-month fishing seasons. You see here huge consolidation, and I think this is just for halibut, but we have similar consolidation in the sablefish fishery. So the fleets have decreased by about 2/3 for both halibut and sablefish. In terms of quota shareholders, that has been a bit less. So I think, let's see here, 44% for halibut, 21% for sablefish. So really, one of the things that has happened since the implementation of the program is you have quota shareholders pulling their IFQ onto fewer vessels, and that's in part due to the kind of flexibility of the program. It's one of the things that the council kind of intended for, was for fewer vessels participating. But it's also likely to be associated with these decreasing tax, so people really have to kind of, have more pounds on the boat in order to make economically worthwhile fishing trips. You've had changes in crew employment. So we don't gather data on crew members in the IFQ fisheries, really across any of our state fisheries, except the big ones. We really don't have crew information. But we know, given this huge consolidation, that there has been a big loss of crew jobs in these fisheries. But we've also heard that the jobs are more stable, they are safer, and they provide for higher earnings. Although in terms of the percent of the crew share going to IFQ participants, that has likely decreased as more costs are being subtracted before you get to that crew share. So we've also, like I was noting in the beginning, we've seen substantial changes in how halibut is processed. So we've really moved from largely frozen to fresh production, so about 20 to 60% increase. And so that has also provided for big dockside price increases since the implementation of the IFQ program. But with these changes in processing needs, we've also seen big changes in the processing sector itself. So many of those who had been processing halibut prior to IFQs have since left. And there has been an influx of, in some cases, just buyers that move halibut down south. So one of the things here that is kind of emerging is that transportation has become a critical part of the picture for Alaskan and coastal communities to kind of remain viable in terms of processing, and I'll get into that in a little bit as well. So increased fish prices also resulting in increased revenues for those boats that have remained in these fisheries. We've also seen huge increases in the quota share prices, as I'm sure many of you know. So last time I looked, actually the quota share prices in 3A decreased by about $20 this year, so about a third. That's from conversations with participants in the fleet. That's due to, you know, both decreases in the tax and concerns about the decreasing dockside prices. But they're still up in, you know, the 40s for 3A and in the 60s for Southeast, where we have fewer quota share moving across the market.
And first, I just want to, for those who aren't, TAC is total allowable.
Oh yes, total allowable catch, sorry.
That helps some.
There's a lot of
Yeah.
acronyms.
A lot of acronyms, please call me out. And then the last thing is we've seen a big increase in hired masters in the fisheries. So from about 15 to 50% in halibut and 15 to 60% in sablefish. Now I said in the beginning we didn't allow leasing, but we do allow it for special provisions like medical and beneficiary. So if someone passes, you have 3 years to lease their IFQ, and we see an increasing utilization, especially of the medical lease provision, which I think, are you touching on the medical one? Okay, that's something that the council, I think, is addressing with some current measures, though. There were some concerning things that were emerging from the IFQ program review about the potential abuse of that provision.
Well, you guys have like an enforcement arm. I mean, I'm just curious, like, let's say you did abuse it, you know, you did not have a medical, I mean, let's face it, you can find the right doctor, you can buy a whole bottle of heroin, you know, so you could find the right doctor. I know damn well you could lease your permit.
Right.
You guys have like an enforcement thing to find, these guys are finding the you know, doctor happy or whatever, or is it just kind of compliance, voluntary compliance?
That's what the issue is right now, is that it seems like there might be some people who are, there really isn't a good way to enforce it, and NIMS is in the position where they're having to make determinations of whether they think, like, somebody had arthritis in one arm last year, and this year they have arthritis in the other arm, and is that a fair use of the lease provision? So the council is currently looking at that to see if there should be some more specific language so that nobody has to make, like, an uncomfortable decision that they're not in a position of authority to make.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, you know, the internal revenue operates on the theory of turn in your buddy. I mean, really, they have no enforcement arm other than you turn in your friends and your neighbors, and that's how they do, you know. And I was just hoping you guys wouldn't go that way because we kind of cheapened the fishery, as it were, you know.
Yeah.
I have a comment. So, last spring, I was thinking about getting knee surgery, and I called up NIMS to see if I could, would I need to medical out my quota. And since I had a little bit of original quota, that you're not allowed to do that. I don't know, to me, it's a kind of a glitch in the regulation. You can't medical out, you have to
Because
hire somebody to run your boat,
it's a hired skipper option
Right.
instead, yeah.
which I didn't think was fair. I don't really want somebody running my boat, actually, that I don't know, or, I don't know, it just seemed like it was unfair to the people that originally had quota, that were in the program from the beginning. Because if you bought, what you call second generation, people that bought in, or bought quota and didn't have the original issue, they are allowed to medical out.
And then they don't have to have equity in the boat, they could just use a different boat in that situation.
Well, even if they had equity in a boat, it wouldn't matter, they could automatically just lease them.
Right, yeah,
So, anyhow,
yeah.
I just thought, I thought that was kind of, something that maybe, I don't know, should be addressed at some point.
Yeah, I don't think that's in the current paper, but it's something that could be considered.
So when the hired skipper provision, isn't it a fact that, the quota, the person that's leasing the quota has to have a 20% ownership in the vessel?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's why it's different than the leasing, the real like medical lease. There doesn't need to be equity in the vessel, but if you're gonna use a hired skipper, the quota holder has to have some equity in that vessel.
Yeah, are you getting into those nuances as well? That hired
Not
master
in that
stuff?
detail,
Yeah.
but I can, with questions
The
about it.
hired master provision is one of, I think it's the most amended provision in the IFQ program, so we've had at least 5, because the council has been concerned that it's kind of been, it was intended to provide, initial recipients with the latitude to continue in the business practices that they had had at the time of IFQ implementation. But since time, those folks have consolidated a lot of quota shares, so now they're using it across a bunch of different areas and more pounds, and also other folks who hadn't been using it have started using it, to kind of engage in a little bit of de facto relationship. So there's a 20% vessel ownership obligation for the 12 months before you are using a hired master. So the council has kind of iteratively tried to address some of the abuses that are emerging with that, but I think it's an ongoing issue that we're thinking about. So yeah, I went through some of those big changes since IFQs, and those would be drivers of effects specifically on rural Alaska. But before I really start this definition, I want to be clear that we don't necessarily have a definition of rural Alaska. So the census uses one, the Federal Subsistence Board uses one. The North Pacific Council has utilized different population cutoffs when they're thinking about community protection measures. So when we were doing the IFQ review, we defined rural communities as those with 2,500 or fewer people. And that's a definition that has been used by the census. So we looked at how landings and quota share holdings have changed, if they've changed over time for rural Alaska communities. And really kind of for rural Alaska, quota share holdings and landings have been pretty stable since the implementation of the IFQ program. But once you kind of start to dig into this category of rural communities, you do see that there is a migration of both quota share and IFQ landings between rural communities. So as I kind of alluded to earlier, we found that transportation access was kind of a key, seemed to be a key component of why some communities may be losing out in quota share. So, and that's aligned with kind of this movement from the frozen to fresh halibut market, and the need for access to transportation to be able to move fish down south to access that fresh market. And I'll just note that some of the quota share movement is due to sales out of the communities, but some of it is also due to quota share holders themselves moving out of the community. So we didn't really differentiate for the purposes of the review on that. I feel like I'm missing slides. Maybe not. Okay, I guess I skipped around. So, so early on in the IFQ program, the council realized that some Gulf of Alaska communities were being adversely affected by the IFQ program and the loss of fishing opportunities. So it created the Community Quota Entity Program to provide for access and participation opportunities for folks from these communities. So under the program, CQEs, which are non-profit entities, are allowed to buy halibut and sablefish quota share for harvest by residents of those communities. The program has 46 communities that are eligible to purchase quota share. You can see the criteria for eligibility. So populations of fewer than 1,500, lack of road access, historical participation, direct saltwater access. And I'll just note that this program was intended for Gulf of Alaska communities, and ADAC was added as a CQE community, I think in 2013 or something like that. Yeah. So, and the program has also expanded, so CQEs can apply to get charter halibut permits, to get Pacific cod licenses to participate. And really kind of the crux of the CQE program is that the CQEs have to be self-funded, so they have to find their own money to buy halibut and sablefish quota share. So that's different than for those who are familiar with the Western Alaska CQE program. Those folks got a direct allocation of halibut and sablefish. So the program has not been particularly effective in terms of CQEs actually buying quota share. There's only 4 that have bought quota share. Only 3 of those are in the Gulf of Alaska, and that's largely due to this kind of necessity to find funding to buy quota share in a market where, like I said, those prices are pretty high. So I'm gonna get kind of back into the rural access issues in a second, but I wanted to go over the new entry opportunities findings from the IFQ review as well. So I'm defining new entrants as those acquiring quota share who are not initial recipients of quota share. So since 2009-10, new entrants are the majority quota shareholders, so they hold over 50% of all the halibut and sablefish quota share. But still about 23 to 29%, and that differs by regulatory area, of the initially allocated quota share is still held by initial recipients in these fisheries, so it is a substantial chunk. The rate of entry has declined over time, so it fell from about 7% in the first several years. So in terms of relative to the number of total share, quota shareholders, it was about 7% in the first couple years, and now it's about 2 to 3% since 1998. So there's, I think we kind of have gone over these a bit, but there's a lot of factors leading to folks not buying into these fisheries. Obviously, high quota share prices. There's concerns about the health of these stocks, maybe less so with black cod now. Some concerns over sector allocations, so potential reallocations to charter halibut permit holders, and with the trawl fleets and bycatch issues. And then operating costs, so this is one we hear about in terms of new fees, observer coverage, and those kinds of things, really limiting people's desire to participate. One of the kind of interesting things, I think, when we were doing the IFQ reviews, we talked to some lenders, so those who provide loans for quota share, and they noted that they have increased their restrictiveness of their loan conditions due to these concerns as well. So in the face of uncertainty about the health and these kinds of rising quota share prices, they are afraid that people will essentially not be able to make their loan payments. So they're asking for increased collateral when you get a loan for quota share purchases. So the principal balances of quota share loans in some IFQ areas are actually slightly greater than the estimated current market value of their underlying quota. So in fact, you may own more on your quota share purchase than the quota share is currently worth. And so that's a big concern for lenders in the program. So they're asking for secondary collateral. They're looking for bigger down payments. They're looking for income diversification, and those kinds of things. So quota share holders, so those who already own quota share, kind of the other side of the picture, talk about capital gains taxes, kind of keeping them from offering up their quota share on the market. And so that's kind of the other side of the picture. And then we're also seeing a rise of gift transfers in the IFQ fisheries. from about 10 to 20 to 30% of quota share transactions. And those are aligned with transfers between family members. So this might be kind of associated with that capital gains tax concern, because you can kind of escape that if you're doing a gift transfer. Okay, and so my colleagues and I at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center kind of took the IFQ review and the outputs in terms of quota shareholding movement between rural Alaska communities, and we wanted to see if we systematically model this. What kinds of characteristics of rural Alaska communities really matter to the decision for people to sell halibut quota share? So we controlled for the person's age, kind of factors that would potentially affect their decision to sell. How much quota share they hold in terms of the amount, the diversity, the type. And then we looked at these kinds of community variables. So the population, and then we used different population cutoffs. Transportation access, so is the community on the road system? Does it have an airport? And then we actually defined the airport as one that has a runway of 4,500 feet or more, because we talked to a state aviation planner, and that's he told us that's what you need to land a medium-sized cargo plane to be able to move fresh fish out of the community. And then whether they have a halibut buyer. So all these factors kind of combine to see, what is still significant in terms of someone's probability of selling quota share. So, as you might imagine, market access is really an important factor. But when we account for initial quota share allocations, the type of quota share people have, how much, whether that quota shareholder is from a community that does not have an airport or a fish buyer, is still really important in terms of driving quota share selling decisions. So in other words, if you're from a small community with no airport or fish buyer, you're more likely to sell your quota share than someone from a larger community. So we think essentially that this movement of processing capacity out of some small remote rural Alaska communities and the changing needs for halibut processing really led to some loss of access for rural Alaska. And then understanding these kinds of community characteristics, really specific community characteristics that are tied to transfer decisions, can inform better policies. And so Sarah's going to go over this a little bit, but the council is currently looking at active participation measures in the IFQ fisheries, discussing entry and so on. And so this is kind of where we're hoping this kind of research can be applied. And then IFQ programs more broadly, so around the world. So really, briefly, a summary of the 20-year review. For the smallest and most remote Alaska communities, participation in IFQ fisheries has really decreased. So the kind of population cutoff that we found really kind of was consistently significant in terms of leading to quota share selling was communities of 1,500 or fewer folks. New entry has declined and is facing numerous obstacles, and then the CQE program really was not effective in terms of promoting fishing opportunities in remote Gulf of Alaska communities.
So I just want to talk a little bit now about what's next. Now that we've had the 20-year program review, we know that quota programs like this are inherently limiting. They were really, one of the intentions was to reduce capitalization into fishery. And we've had 20 plus years of other research to sort of understand different distributional impacts of the program. So what happens now? The council has talked about the 20-year review as a good opportunity to look closer at the program and see if there are some substantial changes that need to be made. In particular, we've had different proposals and ideas of aging out, getting in, and fairness. Those have been big topics of discussions, different ideas around that. If there were going to be any changes to the program, generally they would go through the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, the group that I work for. And before I tell you what they're working on, I want to give a brief overview of who they are, in case some people aren't familiar. Just very briefly, the North Pacific Council is responsible for federal fisheries off Alaska, so that's anywhere from 3 miles out to 200 miles. Anywhere closer is usually state jurisdiction. And in general, groundfish, crab is jointly managed with the state, and to some extent halibut as well. The council has a scientific and statistical committee, an advisory panel, and they also have different fishery-specific and issue-specific committees that they put together to help advise them on specific topics, and they always receive public testimony as well. The council is made up of 11 voting members. 6 of them are from Alaska, and 5 of them are from Washington, Oregon. The decisions that they make have to do with how federal fishing occurs, so who catches it, when, using what gear types, and how much. So they set the limits, the catch limits for groundfish off of Alaska. Halibut is a little different. Some of you probably know there's an international body that manages halibut and sets the catch limits, the International Pacific Halibut Commission, that has U.S. commissioners and Canadian commissioners. The council designed the IFQ program and does some management with who catches it and the gear types that they use, but the catch limits are set by the IPHC. So as Marysia already said, the council created the IFQ program, and if there were going to be some modifications, it would generally go through the council process. There are a few council members that have participated in or do participate in halibut and sablefish fisheries, and the council also has an IFQ committee to advise them on these issues, made up more broadly of members that have experience and involvement in these fisheries. So harvesters, some processor representatives, different community representatives, and both first and second generation fishermen in that committee. I think there's been some Cordovans that have participated in the IFQ committee before. So the proposals for changes to federal fisheries management can always be submitted to the council for consideration at one of their 5 annual meetings during staff tasking. And if anybody is interested in more of how to make a proposal, for example, about medical lease or something else, I've got lots of literature and I can guide you there after the presentation. I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that are being considered now, which have primarily come from IFQ committee members. As I mentioned, these are primarily ideas related to access into the fisheries. The proposed changes and their effects will likely not lead to benefits for all. Addressing some of these concerns in the program are not as simple as they seem on the surface. These are tough issues. So there are several ideas that are being considered in discussion paper form soon. They're kind of on our to-do list as council staffers to think about and talk about these issues. Discussion paper is council code for, we want to know a little bit more about this, but the federal process is very slow. None of these issues are about to be acted on. These are things they're thinking about. So for example, the first topic is looking at potential modifications to hired skipper provisions. Fishermen have been differently impacted by the hired skipper provisions, which essentially allows initial issuees, we were talking about this a little before, people or entities who are participating in the program when the quota was first issued, it gives them the opportunity to have a skipper, somebody else, go out on the water and fish their quota. So if they're an entity, if they're an LLC, they really need to assign a person to go out and fish the quota. So there are sort of there's probably many, but sort of 2 sentiments here. Some people have expressed how much the program, the hired skipper provision, has benefited them. quota shareholders that don't necessarily have to be on the boat, and they can help manage the business, and this is how they've operated in the past, might find this an important feature of the program. But we've also heard from some hired skippers that this is a mutually beneficial arrangement for them too. That especially some initial issuees that didn't have to pay $62 a pound for their quota and have huge loans, maybe they'd take a smaller lease rate, and so there'd be more revenue for the boat and crew compared to somebody who had to buy in. So we've heard from some people that they like this provision and they don't want it changed. The other sentiment, and we've heard from some people in Cordova in public testimony at council meetings, is that the ability for initial issuees to hire somebody to go out and fish their quota means that they're hanging on to it longer than they might if they have to go out and fish it themselves. So this might decrease the supply of available quota and drive up the price for the remaining quota because it's so valuable to them. And some people that can use hired skippers are taking a really high lease rate. We got a public testimony from the mayor of Cordova talking about 75% lease rates in some cases where the quota shareholder, and quota is so expensive if you're buying in right now, some people feel like they're gonna need to take a large amount in order to pay off their loans. So that doesn't leave very much left for the boat and the skipper that's fishing and the crew. And it doesn't leave much to pay people in a way that normally attracts people to the hard work of fishing. So this is a really tough situation. In one case, it's somebody's opportunity into the fishery, and the other case, it feels like it's somebody's barrier to entry to getting into the fishery. So that's one thing we're gonna look at. Another paper is about increasing the active participation requirements in order to receive IFQ on an annual basis from NIPS. So currently there's, as Marysia mentioned, there's 150 days of crew time in some U.S. fishery. So there's been talk of maybe changing that to a higher number. And that really leads to a whole greater discussion that we've had in other fisheries like the crab rationalization program of what does it mean to be active, and there are lots of different ways to define it. It is very tricky to come to a consensus of what that means, and it would be even more difficult to really regulate what it means to be active. A third paper would look at other regulatory and non-regulatory options for opening up entry for active participation. So we've talked about specific regulatory provisions, but maybe there's some non-regulatory things that can be done to try to create markets for younger generation people coming in and trying to make connections between people who are thinking about trying to retire out and trying to keep quota in communities. Maybe there's some non-regulatory solutions. And then the fourth discussion paper that I wanted to mention is our task is to look at global examples of other IFQ type programs that have done a better job at facilitating entry opportunities and rural access, and to see what they're doing differently and if there's anything that we can apply to this IFQ fishery. Any takeaway messages? The challenge here is that at this point the pie has been allocated, and it would be nice if the pie were bigger. We definitely love more halibut right now, but at this point it's sort of a zero-sum game. Creating a slice of the pie for entry opportunities means that you could be disadvantaging the people who have recently bought in or have worked to build up their fishing business. So these topics make up 4 separate discussion papers. I should add that there are a few other halibut and sablefish actions that the council is looking at, and there's a list of them on the back table if you want to see all the specifics. I'd be happy to go into more after the presentation. To give you a little bit of insight into my job and what happens now with these 4 discussion papers, or other staff who might be working on them. Without council staff taking a stance and saying what the council should do, we look at them and try to tease apart the different potential impacts on the different user groups. Some of them are obvious. If you make a proposal, you generally probably know how that is going to affect you, but it's our job as council staff to think about direct and indirect impacts on other user groups. We talk about at our job playing whack-a-mole a lot. If you if you squeeze access in one area, where are those people gonna go? What fisheries are they gonna get into? And who else might it affect? Think about the incentives that these regulations might create, and how fishermen might respond to those incentives. And so when the council is making a decision on some of these big issues, they're supposed to consider resource efficiency. We want our fisheries to be profitable. But if that was all they could use in the decision-making process, then we'd only have big vertically integrated boats that, go down to Seattle and make the most money possible. But they also are charged with, through the goals of the IFQ program and also the national standards, they think about distributional impacts at different levels. And they're supposed to consider community impacts and processor impacts, impacts to different specific vessel types, and other user groups. So circling back to the proposals of the IFQ program, there's really unlikely to be an easy fix here in terms of access and entry into the fisheries, short of just getting rid of the IFQ program. And that's not on the table right now. So if the council takes action related to these issues, there could be some user groups that are adversely impacted in order to create entry opportunities for others. Ultimately, the council, if the council deems that there's a change that's warranted because the net benefits or the distributional impacts are worth it, they could still choose to take action. So if you're involved in the fisheries, it's important to pay attention and understand and get your input heard. And I'd be happy to go into more ways to get your input heard after the presentation if you're interested.
Okay, so one of the kinds of things that we do as researchers at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center is that we kind of have these longer time spans to look at things, and we try to create research programs that can filter up into the management process and be utilized in informing the council about distributional changes and impacts, kind of, filling gaps that, Sarah might not have time to address, and looking at kind of cross-sectional distributional issues that they might not be considering. So one of the kind of effects for me personally after doing the IFQ program review and then having my son, pictured here obviously, right after that was done, is that I started thinking about like a fishing family heritage and an identity, and what do I want to pass on to my son? I'm not from a fishing family, but it's kind of a consideration that I've heard from fishing families across the state. And so we realized that this was kind of that families were this intermediary between individuals and communities that were really not well studied in Alaska, and we hadn't really thought about impacts of changing fishing conditions on the family unit. So we've created this series of workshops that Sarah and I have been hosting in Gulf of Alaska communities since last year, to try to examine how families are affected by and respond to changes in fishing conditions. So we don't just talk about the IFQ program review. Obviously that's not relevant to that, necessarily to everyone. We talk about prices, we talk about environmental changes, other management changes, so including within the state fisheries, to kind of try to paint a broader, more holistic understanding of the various things that families are responding to and how they might be responding to them. So we've hosted, we're going to be hosting 7 total workshops. So we've been to Juneau, Homer, Sitka, Anchorage, Kodiak, Petersburg, and tomorrow, shameless plug, we are here. We'll be hosting a workshop at 5:30 in the education room at the Cordova Center. And so again, this is another one of those avenues for, where information from participants in various fisheries can really come to inform the process of fisheries management. So broadly, the objectives of these workshops are to identify major themes across Gulf of Alaska communities in terms of the stressors that people are responding to, the effects of those stressors on them, how they might be adapting, and the kinds of strategies they're employing, and the limitations on those strategies potentially, and how that might in turn affect families. And then to try to identify whether there are kind of future avenues for research that we need to dive into as well. And so I think that's the last slide. I might have omitted a thank you slide, but I'm going to put my son instead. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. Kim, do you want to pop a light back there? If there's any questions or any reflections that you'd like to give Terry?
We did a lot of talking today. Tomorrow is a listening session, so hopefully you can make it and you guys can do some of the talking.
It's a big, different world. I mean, I think a lot of the people in this room know of bits and pieces of the IQ system, and like you say, we're pretty salmon-centric here, but it's still definitely an important part of the mix of resident as well as seasonal fishermen that come here and deliver product. I mean, I think as I look at some of the things that you talked about, I mean, it's really key to have the processing capability that we do have here, which is actually per capita and per size is pretty darn impressive. I'm sure you, with this many processors in a town of 2,000 or so that really are functional. And so the deliveries of halibut and sablefish in this community is another important input into our community, whether or not it's owned by locals. Yeah, so there's many ways to cut the pie, I guess.
So is those was it the CDQs or something like one? Is Cordova not eligible for doing one of those?
Cordova is not a CQE community.
Is there any thought about making it larger population size to get Cordova in?
Well, so the challenge is that even the CQE communities that exist have really struggled because the quota is so expensive.
Right.
So it hasn't seemed to be a silver bullet for community access. There's been other types of community quota ideas, different types proposed recently, but some of you may know, Marysia alluded to the community development quota in the Bering Sea, where the groups were allocated. Right around the same time that the IFQ program was implemented, the communities were allocated quota for halibut, but also a bunch of other species, and they've been pretty successful in building up their programs and doing economic development with some of the revenue and things like that because they didn't buy in.
I got a question or comment coming from a fisherman, former fish biologist. Trying to get into halibut and economic feasibility is impossible with the loan situation. And this is a crazy idea, it's not a crazy idea, I don't know how you would do this legally, but you're talking, you got the older guys that have had them forever, they want to get out, they don't want to do capital gains. Is there any, the way it needs to happen is for them to be able to pass it to the younger generation and loan it to them, or be the banker. I mean, the banker makes more money than me for a long time. But if the guy that has it and is sitting on it can sell it to the young guy, age is irrelevant in that, but the new guy, let's say, or gal, but then the feds can, hold the note or something, keep the banker out, let the guy selling it make interest for those years when the guy's buying it. And to me, some sort of solution like that is a way to, because no one who buys something and puts 50% down. I mean, that's almost impossible, especially at those rates. And that's what you have to do these days. So it's impossible for the new guy to get in my opinion.
Yeah, especially with where the halibut catch limits are right now. It's
Right.
really challenging because, as we were talking about, you're buying units, and those units the pie has gotten so small that those units are worth a lot less pounds. I mean, I'm not sure about that. That could be a non-regulatory solution that we could consider in one of those discussion papers if there's other ways. One of the other ideas for that non-regulatory solutions paper is in the crab program, they have a right of first offer program, which is where if somebody's looking to get out, it's this website where the connections are already made, so it facilitates going to active by a definition that the crabbers have created, and they have to put up at least 10% of their quota to this definition of active participants. But I don't think it gets around the capital gains issue. So, yeah, I'd have to look more into that to see if there's a possibility there.
I mean, I'd love to see something like that, because that, to me, I'm not the guy holding them, but I can look at it as a banker's standpoint. If the guy holding them, gal holding them, doesn't have to pay capital gains, gains interest by selling it, they're benefiting, and has a guarantee, because that doesn't happen now, because once you hand that permit over someone, they can take it. So it's very rare that someone gives a personal loan on a limited entry permit because of how it's set up, which is a good thing because business doesn't get it. So you need to protect that person that's selling it, obviously, somehow, but you need to help the new guy, besides going to the open market banker who's just taking your money. I don't know. A lot to work out, obviously, in that, but I'd love to see something figured out.
I think we've got a lot to think about there.
You mentioned that you've been looking at other TAC programs and IRQ programs internationally, and this whole sort of challenge of decoupling the value of the access rights from the market values. I mean, it's sort of a slippery slope, obviously, and we're at the bottom end of that slope. If, for whatever reason, whether it's scarcity of quota or just a really healthy seafood market, right? You've got a lot of dynamics on this access privilege cost. Have you seen any other programs in Europe or internationally that is informing kind of this same issue?
Yeah, so that discussion paper about looking into other international programs, that came because the council received a report from Courtney Carruthers and others, you may have heard of her, about, what is it? Grain of the Fleet, what's the? Turning of the Tides, yeah. They did a big research project and looked at a bunch of, and I think it was a program in Norway specifically that they were, they gave a couple of different examples, but there's a program in Norway that has some kind of younger generation entry quota. And so that discussion paper is supposed to look at the turning of the tides and programs in, for example, Norway and maybe somewhere else, and see if the types of programs that we have here could have something like that included in them.
I think one of the things that, the council comes up against when it's trying to think of new ideas is that because they're managing federal fisheries, they're kind of really restricted in what they, how they can affect these things. So in Norway, I think, they had kind of age restrictions or something like that. Like in other quota programs around the world, you kind of have more latitude in what you can do. In federal fisheries, you, for instance, can't discriminate against different participants across states. So that's kind of one of the big factors for Alaska. We can't discriminate based on age or anything like that. And so, I think the goal of that, the paper that Sarah is talking about is to take those examples from universal catch-share programs and see, given the limitations of what the council can do, is there something in there that, we can actually think about?
It's a heavy topic. This isn't your usual role.
My thing, I think, is I remember when this whole thing was implemented, all the discussion was sitting in the boat harbor in Yakutat, drinking incredible quantities of alcohol and smoking really good pot and discussing. We were all fishermen because we had a huge fleet come up from Sitka that would fish out of Yakutat. So you had, you know, the big southeast contingent as well as the locals, and just discussing this IFQ and limited entry and all this going on, you know. And then now 20 years later, just to see how it all kind of is playing out. And it's pretty much as the old timers predicted. I mean, this is pretty much what they said is gonna happen, is a few big players are gonna own everything. And that's pretty much how it seems to be going, you know. Yeah, I mean, there's no room for the little guy and the beginner, you know. And that's, he said, yeah, you guys are done. If you don't get in now, you'll never get in. And it seems to be about how it's going.
Yeah, they put specific provisions in there to try to slow that down, but, it's sort of the general trajectory that, Florida programs kind of move towards this
The big fish eat
consolidation.
up the little fish.